On October 15, 1888, the town of Fort Smith, Arkansas, witnessed an event that would haunt its people for generations to come. A wedding between 45-year-old Nathaniel Decker and 22-year-old Rose Sullivan was held just 3 months after the strange hunting accident that took the life of William Decker, Nathaniel's own son and Rose's first fiancée. What looked like a grieving father stepping in to protect his late son's bride was in truth the outcome of the most carefully planned and dark love affair in Sebastian County's history. Their fiery conspiracy involved 3 failed attempts at murder, steady poisoning, and finally a calculated execution disguised as a hunting accident. Records hidden deep in the Sebastian County courthouse basement for more than a century reveal a trail of evidence that authorities chose to ignore, and witnesses who either vanished or died under suspicious conditions whenever they dared to speak too openly about what they had witnessed. Before we go deeper into the story of Nathaniel Decker and the woman who helped him kill his own son, make sure to subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments which state you are listening from. Because this story of forbidden love and family betrayal will make you question how far people are willing to go when desire consumes them. The truth about what happened in those Arkansas lumber camps had been buried along with William Decker, yet the clues had always been there for anyone daring enough to search. Sebastian County in 1888 stood as one of Arkansas's wealthiest regions, built upon the riches flowing from its massive timber industry and the busy river trade along the Arkansas River. Fort Smith, the county seat, had grown from a rough frontier military post into a lively commercial town where lumber magnates, cattle ranchers, and river traders battled for power in the rapidly expanding post-Civil War economy. Nathaniel Decker had arrived in Sebastian County 15 years earlier, a determined young man from Tennessee with enough savings to buy a failing sawmill and the ambition to turn it into the largest lumber business between Little Rock and the Indian Territory. By 1888, Decker Lumber Company employed more than 200 men and controlled thousands of acres of valuable timberland in the Ozark foothills. The sound of Nathaniel's steam-powered saws echoed through the Arkansas River Valley from dawn until dusk, and his lumber supplied construction projects as far away as Kansas City and New Orleans. At 45, Nathaniel was an impressive figure in Fort Smith society. Standing 6 feet tall, with steel, gray hair and piercing blue eyes, he commanded respect through both his business skill and his practiced charm. His wife Margaret had died of consumption 3 years earlier, leaving him to raise their only son, William, who was then 23 and already showing signs of the weak health that had troubled the Decker men for generations. William Decker embodied everything his father both admired and resented about his own bloodline. The young man carried his father's intelligence and his mother's gentle spirit, but he lacked the ruthless determination that had built the family's fortune. Where Nathaniel saw chance and profit, William saw duty. Where his father demanded results, William preferred peace and compromise. At 26, William managed the company's bookkeeping and customer relations, jobs that kept him far from the dangerous machines and grueling labor that Nathaniel believed forged true character. The lumber camps themselves stretched across the thickly forested hills east of Fort Smith, linked to the main mill by a narrow gauge railroad line that hauled massive logs down to the Arkansas River. These camps were home to a rough crowd of loggers, many of them Irish and German immigrants who had left the crowded industrial cities of the North in search of steady work on America's growing frontier. They lived in crude wooden bunkhouses, worked 6 days a week in brutal conditions that claimed several lives every year, and spent their Saturday nights drinking and gambling in the saloons of Fort Smith's infamous River District. It was into this rugged, masculine world of sawdust, sweat, and sudden death that Rose Sullivan arrived on a cool September morning in 1888, stepping off the paddle steamer Memphis Belle, with only a worn carpetbag and a letter of introduction from William Decker. Rose had been born in County Cork, Ireland, but her family had moved to Boston when she was 7 years old. Her father, Patrick Sullivan, worked the docks until tuberculosis took him when Rose was just 15. Her mother, Bridget took in laundry and sewing to keep food on the table for Rose and her two younger brothers. But the family constantly struggled against poverty and the heavy anti-Irish prejudice that filled Boston's job market. When a marriage broker approached Bridget Sullivan in the summer of 1888, with word that a wealthy Arkansas businessman was searching for a suitable Irish wife for his son, the family believed it was nothing less than providence. William Decker had placed his request through a series of Catholic parish connections. He wanted a young woman of good character, devout faith, and practical skills who would be willing to travel west and marry a prosperous lumber heir. Rose fit those requirements, but she also carried something unspoken, an intelligent and ambitious nature that chafed against the narrow roles allowed to Irish immigrant women in America at that time. At 22, she had already worked as a seamstress, a shop clerk, and even a tutor for wealthy Protestant families who paid her less than they paid their stable hands. The idea of marrying a lumber heir represented not only freedom from hardship, but entrance into a social class that had always been kept out of reach for someone of her background. Her journey to Arkansas took nearly 3 weeks, traveling first by train to New York, then by riverboat down the Mississippi, before reaching the Arkansas River. William had sent money for first-class passage along with detailed letters about his family, his business, and his dreams for their future. His letters revealed a gentle, thoughtful man who wrote poetry, collected books, and dreamed of expanding the family business into furniture making. Yet when Rose finally arrived in Fort Smith and met her intended husband at the Riverside Depot, she felt the first faint wave of disappointment that would, in time, lead to disaster. William Decker was exactly what his letters had described: kind, educated, secure, and completely ordinary. He greeted her with nervous politeness, helped her into his family's carriage, and spent the ride home apologizing for the dust, the heat, and the rough appearance of the lumber workers they passed along the road. The Decker mansion stood on Garrison Avenue, Fort Smith's most elegant street, a grand 3-story Victorian home with wraparound porches, fancy gingerbread trim, and carefully kept gardens that showed off the family's success. Servants carried Rose's things to the guest quarters, where she would stay until the wedding set for October 20th, just 6 weeks away. It was during dinner that first night that Rose met Nathaniel Decker, and her carefully planned future began to unravel. The Decker dining room reflected the fine luxury that timber wealth could buy in 1888 Arkansas. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light, cross mahogany furniture brought in from New Orleans, while old paintings of quiet landscapes hung on walls covered in deep burgundy wallpaper. The dining table could easily seat 12, though on that September evening, only 3 places had been set on the spotless white linen cloth. Nathaniel entered the room at exactly 700, as he always did, wearing a perfectly fitted black suit that showed off his broad shoulders and tall frame. Rose, who had been chatting politely with William about his book collection, felt her breath catch as she watched Nathaniel move with the assured stride of a man used to absolute obedience. "Father, may I present Miss Rose Sullivan?" William said, jumping up from his chair with the nervous energy that seemed to color all his actions. "Rose, this is my father, Nathaniel Decker." And Nathaniel took Rose's offered hand in both of his, holding it a moment longer than courtesy required, while his intense blue eyes studied her face. "Miss Sullivan," he said, his deep voice carrying weight and authority, "William's letters hardly did justice to your beauty. Welcome to our home." The compliment was improper. A father should not speak so directly about his son's bride to be, yet Rose found herself stirred by the boldness of it. After years of dealing with men who saw her either as a servant or a burden, Nathaniel's direct admiration felt like recognition of her worth as a woman, not simply her usefulness as a wife. Throughout dinner, Rose kept stealing glances at Nathaniel while William spoke about his plans for their honeymoon trip to New Orleans. The father dominated the conversation effortlessly, telling stories of his business ventures, his opinions on Arkansas politics, and his struggles building an empire from nothing. when he described the difficulties of managing 200 workers and thousands of acres of timberland. Rose heard the voice of a man who shaped the world according to his will. William, on the other hand, seemed to shrink in his father's presence. He offered timid opinions that he quickly softened with phrases like, "Of course I could be mistaken," or, "Perhaps father sees it differently." When Nathaniel asked about production numbers from the main sawmill, William stumbled through his explanation, clearly nervous about saying anything that might not meet his father's expectations. "You must understand, Miss Sullivan," Nathaniel said as dessert was served, "that William has many good qualities, but business demands a certain ruthlessness that does not come naturally to him. He is too gentle for her for his own good." The remark was delivered with apparent affection, but Rose sensed the steel hidden in Nathaniel's words. Here was a man who noticed weakness even in his own son and felt no hesitation in revealing it. After dinner, William offered to show Rose the family library, but Nathaniel cut in. "Perhaps Miss Sullivan would enjoy seeing the timber operations. I'm riding out to Camp 3 tomorrow morning to inspect our new steam donkey. A woman preparing to marry into the lumber business should understand where our wealth comes from." William opened his mouth as if to object. Clearly, he had planned a quiet morning, introducing Rose to his poetry books. But his father's suggestion carried the weight of an order. "Of course," William said in a weak voice. If Rose would find that interesting, Rose agreed at once, though she could not have explained why. Something about Nathaniel's invitation felt dangerous, and danger had been absent from her carefully ordered life for far too long. The next morning arrived crisp and bright, with the first colors of autumn painting the oak and maple trees east of Fort Smith. Rose dressed in her most practical outfit, a dark blue autumn dress with a minimal bustle, so she could ride side saddle with ease. When she came to the stables behind the Decker mansion, she found Nathaniel waiting with 2 horses, a calm mare for her and a powerful stallion for himself. William was nowhere to be found. "My son sends his regrets," Nathaniel explained as he helped Rose into the saddle. "He received an urgent message from our timber agent in Van Buren, requiring his attention. Business waits for no man." Rose accepted the explanation, though something in Nathaniel's tone hinted that William's absence might not have been accidental. As they rode through the morning mist toward the logging camps, she studied her companion's profile, noting the firm line of his jaw and how the early sunlight caught the silver threads in his dark hair. The ride to Camp 3 took nearly 2 hours, following rough logging trails that wound through thickening forest. Nathaniel proved an engaging companion, sharing stories of the early days of his lumber enterprise and pointing out landmarks that marked the spread of his holdings. He spoke with true passion about the work itself. The thrill of felling a towering oak that had stood for centuries, the difficulty of hauling massive logs down dangerous mountain slopes, the pride of transforming raw timber into planks that would build homes and businesses across the growing American frontier. Camp 3 spread across a clearing on a hillside, overlooking the Arkansas River Valley, a cluster of rough wooden buildings surrounded by great stacks of newly cut logs. At the center stood the steam donkey, a steam-powered winch system used to move logs, its boiler already hissing for the day's labor. Rose had expected to remain on the sidelines while Nathaniel carried out his business, but he insisted on showing her every part of the operation. He explained how the steam donkey's cable system could drag logs weighing several tons up slopes impossible for horses to climb. He pointed out the careful placement of the guide ropes that kept the giant logs from breaking loose and crushing men below. He even let her try the steam donkey's controls, guiding her hands as she learned how to balance the throttle and the cable release. "You have a natural instinct," he told her after she successfully moved a 1,000-pound log into place. "Most women would be too frightened to attempt it." "I'm not most women," Rose replied, then instantly regretted her boldness. Nathaniel smiled. "No, you certainly are not." They ate lunch at a rough table outside the camp foreman's office, chewing sandwiches and drinking black coffee, while Nathaniel reviewed production records and discussed the next day's felling schedule with his supervisors. Rose noticed how the men treated Nathaniel with respect. Yes, but also with the wary caution of workers who knew their future relied on keeping their employer satisfied. It was during the long ride back to Fort Smith that the conversation shifted towards something that would alter everything. "Tell me," Nathaniel said as they paused beside a stream running through a stand of hickory. "What are your expectations for marriage?" Rose thought carefully before answering. "I expect to be a good wife, to support my husband's work, and to raise children who will continue the family name." "Those are admirable goals," Nathaniel replied. "But they don't tell me what you hope to gain from marriage beyond safety and social standing." The bluntness of the question startled Rose. In Boston, no one had ever asked her what she hoped to gain from anything. Survival alone had been enough. "I suppose I want to matter," she said at last. "To be part of something important, something that makes a difference in the world." Nathaniel dismounted and bent to pick up a smooth stone, which he skipped across the creek. "And do you believe marriage to William will give you that chance?" Rose felt her face flush. The question was improper, possibly scandalous, but she could not ignore it. "William is a good man," she began. "That's not what I asked." She slid down from her horse as well, needing to walk, to think, to understand why this exchange felt both perilous and essential. "William is kind and gentle and educated. He will provide well and treat his wife with respect." Again, Nathaniel pressed, "Not what I asked." Rose turned toward him, noting how his blue eyes seemed to pierce through all her careful answers to the truth beneath. "No," she admitted softly. "I don't believe marriage to William will give me that chance. He is satisfied to carry out other people's plans. He'll never create something of his own. And creating something matters to you." "Yes." Nathaniel stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the mix of pine and wood smoke that clung to him. "Then you understand my dilemma. I've spent 25 years building something that will end with me, because my son lacks the will to carry it on." Rose knew she should back away, climb onto her horse, and insist they ride back at once. Instead, she found herself asking, "What do you intend to do about that?" But Nathaniel gave his answer not in words, but in the brief touch of his fingers brushing hers as he helped her back onto her saddle. The touch lasted only a moment, yet it carried a promise that made Rose's heart race with a mixture of fear and longing. They rode in silence the rest of the way to Fort Smith. But something essential had shifted between them. When they reached the Decker mansion, William stood waiting nervously on the porch, having returned from Van Buren hours earlier. "How was your ride?" he asked, his relief clear in every word. "Educational," Rose replied, catching the faint smile that crossed Nathaniel's face at her choice of words. That night, lying awake in her guest room and listening to the strange creaks of the unfamiliar house, Rose realized she had arrived at a turning point that would shape the rest of her life. She could marry William as planned, accept the safe but narrow life he offered, and spend her years wondering what might have been. Or she could follow the dangerous pull she felt toward Nathaniel, knowing that such a choice would demand decisions that would horrify the woman she had been only a day earlier. When sleep finally came, Rose dreamed of steam machines and giant logs, and the steady grip of strong hands guiding her own as she learned how to manage forces powerful enough to reshape the land itself. The weeks after Rose's visit to the timber camp created a rhythm that would have looked perfectly harmless to any outsider. Yet in truth it slowly and deliberately drew her closer into Nathaniel's circle. William, glad to see his fiancée taking interest in the family trade, encouraged what he thought was her sensible wish to understand where their wealth came from. He had no idea that every work trip, every quiet talk about lumber operations, every hour Rose spent with his father was carefully arranged to feed an obsession that grew on both sides. Nathaniel soon found endless reasons to come to the mansion during the day, while William was tied up at the main sawmill. He arrived carrying business papers that needed signatures at once, building plans that supposedly required her review, or urgent notes from timber agents that could not be delayed until evening. These calls almost always included invitations for Rose to join him on small errands, checking possible mill sites, inspecting timber piles at the riverside yards, or meeting machinery dealers who had come all the way from Chicago to win the Decker Company's business. Rose accepted every offer with the eagerness of someone preparing to step into a business empire. She asked smart questions about profits and costs, showed surprising ability to grasp the technical points of lumber grading and steam-powered machines, and expressed genuine wonder at the large-scale planning needed to keep such a vast operation under control. What neither Rose nor Nathaniel admitted to themselves in those early days was that the talk of business was only a cover for a far more private kind of education. Nathaniel was teaching Rose to see through his eyes, to think of power not as something given, but as something to be taken. He taught her to see weakness as a luxury no true leader could afford, and to savor the satisfaction that came from shaping events with one's own will instead of quietly accepting what life handed out. William has never understood, Nathaniel said one crisp October morning as they rode through the timber fields, that in business, like in nature, only the strongest survive. He thinks being fair and reasonable will bring him success, but fairness is a gift only the winners can afford. Rose found herself nodding at words that, just weeks earlier, she would have found disturbing. He does seem to believe others will act honorably just because he does, she replied. Exactly, Nathaniel said. And that belief will ruin everything I have built, unless someone with clearer vision takes charge. Such words hung in the space between them, not fully spoken yet deeply understood. Nathaniel was not only sharing ideas about commerce. He was recruiting Rose, testing how far she would go in embracing a way of life that placed ambition above morals, desire above duty. At the same time, William's own behavior began to shift in subtle ways that only made the difference between him and his father more striking. Perhaps sensing some change in his home, perhaps simply reacting to the sharp tension that always seemed to spark when the three were together. William became more eager to please Rose and more deferential to his father. He sought Nathaniel's approval for choices that should have been his alone. He asked permission before inviting Rose on afternoon walks. He requested his father's opinion about wedding details he should have discussed privately with his bride-to-be. And he constantly softened his own wishes with lines like, "Of course father may have a better idea," or "Maybe we should see what father thinks." This effort to show respect and keep family peace had the opposite effect from what William may have hoped. Instead of making Rose admire him more, his endless yielding to his father's authority only made him appear weak and uncertain. Where Nathaniel commanded, William asked. Where Nathaniel made decisions, William hesitated. Where Nathaniel moved forward, William paused. Rose slowly began to feel deep in her bones what Nathaniel meant when he spoke of strength and weakness. William's gentle nature, so appealing in his letters, now seemed in real life like an inability to stand firm even when it came to matters as personal as his own wedding. He seemed unable to hold opinions that might clash with anyone else's. The turning point came on October 8th, just 12 days before their wedding date. William had planned a private picnic for himself and Rose at Ozark Landing, a lovely spot along the Arkansas River, where paddle steamers stopped to load timber from the Decker mill. He had arranged for the cook to prepare a special lunch, asked the gardener to gather fall flowers for a bouquet, and even written a poem he meant to read as they watched the sun dip into the water. But that afternoon Nathaniel announced that urgent business demanded William's immediate attention at the sawmill. A machinery failure threatened to stop work for days, unless repairs were finished before the next morning. Since William oversaw maintenance schedules, his presence was required. Maybe you could delay your picnic until tomorrow, Nathaniel suggested with an air of sympathy. William looked crushed. He had been preparing this romantic moment for days, attending to each detail with the careful precision he gave to all tasks. "Couldn't the repairs wait until tomorrow morning?" he asked. "The supervisor usually handles problems like this." "The supervisor is bedridden with fever," Nathaniel replied smoothly. "And the machinery dealer from Chicago, who has the replacement parts, leaves tomorrow afternoon. If the work isn't done tonight, we lose a week of production." Rose watched this play with increasing clarity. Nathaniel had not merely asked for his son's help. He had designed the choice so that refusal would appear childish and irresponsible. William could either follow his heart or serve his duty, but only one choice matched his father's definition of maturity. "Of course," William said after a pause. "Business comes first. Rose will understand." To what Rose truly understood was that William would always take the path that avoided conflict, even if it meant giving up his own joy and letting down the woman he swore he loved. "I'm very sorry, Rose," William added, his voice honest in its regret. "We'll have our picnic tomorrow. I promise. The sunset will be just as lovely." Nathaniel, however, offered a different idea. "Perhaps Rose would enjoy seeing the mill while you work on the repairs. She has shown such curiosity about the business, and this would give her an excellent chance to witness our nighttime operations." William brightened at once. His father's proposal seemed like the perfect answer. It showed Nathaniel's thoughtfulness while making sure Rose would not spend the evening lonely and upset. "Would you mind, Rose?" William asked. "Father knows the mill better than anyone, and you did say you wanted to learn every part of the trade." Rose agreed with apparent cheerfulness, though her real excitement had little to do with sawmill work. She was beginning to see Nathaniel's moves for what they were. Not chance events, but carefully crafted openings. The machine breakdown might have been real, but Nathaniel's offer to take her along while William worked was plainly prepared in advance. As evening settled and William left with his tools and manuals for the sawmill, Rose found herself alone with Nathaniel for the first time since their trip to the timber camp. The house seemed different without William's presence. Larger somehow, and charged with possibilities that, until now, had lived only in secret glances and cautious conversations. "Shall we go to the mill?" Nathaniel asked as they stood together in the hall. Rose met his eyes, knowing her answer would decide whether they kept up the fragile show of proper behavior or admitted the attraction that had been rising between them for weeks. "I would rather not," she murmured softly. Nathaniel smiled, and in that smile Rose caught both a promise and a warning. They had crossed into a space from which there would be no return. The mill visit that never occurred marked the beginning of what both Rose and Nathaniel would later think of as the most thrilling and dangerous month of their lives. Instead of walking through sawmill machinery, they spent that October night wandering the shadowed gardens behind the Decker mansion, speaking with the intensity of two people uncovering deep truths about themselves and each other. "I was married once," Nathaniel said, as they paused near the fountain at the garden's center. "I know the difference between simple affection and true passion. William offers you one, but I could give you the other." Rose felt her pulse race at his bluntness. "William is your son." "Yes, he is. And that makes what I feel both impossible and unavoidable." They stood close enough beneath the moonlight that Rose could see silver streaks in Nathaniel's dark hair, and she noticed the way his jaw tightened as he battled emotions that seemed to astonish even him with their force. Here was a man who had built an empire through calculation and steady planning, yet he was admitting to desires that ignored reason and convention. "What are you saying?" Rose asked, though she already understood. "I am saying that some cravings are too strong to set aside, no matter how inconvenient." Rose turned slightly away, needing a breath of space to think clearly. "And William?" "William will endure disappointment. He endured it before." The coldness of that remark should have repelled her, but instead Rose found herself considering its practical weight. In Boston she had been a nobody, just another Irish immigrant girl whose only chance was marriage to a dock worker or a factory man who might give her a roof in return for cleaning and bearing children. William offered her an escape from that small fate. But Nathaniel offered something far more intoxicating, a chance to touch real power, to help shape an empire that would outlive them both. "I need time," she said at last. Nathaniel accepted this with the calmness of a man certain of eventual triumph. "Of course. But don't take too long. Some doors do not open twice." The following morning brought William's warm apologies for the disappointment of the evening before, along with promises that no future work emergency would interrupt their private time again. He had worked until near dawn repairing machinery, and his fatigue only made him more attentive than usual to Rose's comfort and cheer. "Did father give you an interesting mill tour?" he asked over breakfast, clearly hoping Nathaniel's company had made up for his absence. "We never actually went to the mill," Rose replied carefully. "Your father thought it unfit for a lady to see industrial work after dark." William accepted this without hesitation, his relief plain. He had been weighed down with guilt about leaving Rose on what was meant to be their special night, and the thought that she had been properly attended soothed his conscience. What William failed to notice was the brief look that passed between Rose and Nathaniel as she spoke her careful half-truth. It was the first of many small lies they would tell together, the start of a secret pact that would grow into larger deceptions. Over the next days, Nathaniel invented more and more reasons to spend hours with Rose. A possible land purchase needed a woman's eye to judge the house and its condition. A meeting with lumber buyers from New Orleans required the social grace only a polished lady could provide. Suppliers from Chicago wanted entertaining, with refined conversation suitable for business dinners. William not only agreed to these outings, he even encouraged them. To him, his father's eagerness to include Rose in such dealings looked like a sign of acceptance, and Rose's willingness to join showed true interest in their family's livelihood. That his fiancée and his father seemed to enjoy each other's company struck William as proof of his good luck, not as cause for suspicion. But other eyes in Fort Smith were sharper. Mrs. Adelaide Forrester, whose Garrison Avenue mansion overlooked the Decker estate, noticed that Nathaniel's business carriage appeared at his home unusually often during hours when William was occupied at the sawmill. She also observed that these visits stretched for far longer than any business could reasonably demand. Thomas Brennan, manager of the River District's largest hotel, began receiving odd requests from Nathaniel for private dining rooms and discreet suites meant for out-of-town business associates who bore a striking resemblance to Rose Sullivan. When Brennan mentioned these matters to his wife, she remarked that upright businessmen usually kept such meetings in their offices, not hotel rooms. Most troubling of all, Father Michael O'Brien, the Irish priest who was to bless Rose and William's marriage, found himself uneasy after talks with the bride-to-be. When he met her to discuss the holy meaning of Catholic marriage, he sensed a passion that seemed strangely detached from her intended husband. She spoke with fire about creating something lasting, about seeking purpose greater than mere survival, about the joy of having real influence in life. But she never spoke directly about William, about her love for him, or about excitement for their life together. "Marriage is a holy sacrament," Father O'Brien reminded her one afternoon, "not a business deal." Of course, Rose agreed quickly, but her words had the flat sound of duty rather than true belief. These scattered observations might have remained whispers, if not for the meddling of Margaret Henley, Fort Smith's most notorious gossip and wife of the town's second largest lumber dealer. Margaret had built her influence on knowing the private affairs of everyone around her, and her sharp instinct for scandal had already exposed 3 adulterous affairs and 2 theft schemes in just 5 years. Her suspicions awoke when she saw Nathaniel and Rose enter Murphy's Tavern together one Tuesday, when William was away on business in Van Buren. Murphy's served the roughest men in Fort Smith, river hands, loggers, and drovers who preferred whiskey to polite chat. No respectable man would bring his son's fiancée to such a place unless he wished to avoid being noticed elsewhere. Curious, Margaret began her own quiet investigation. She persuaded her Irish maid, Colleen Ali, to strike up conversations with Rose about wedding plans and married life. She convinced her husband to bring Nathaniel to their weekly poker game, hoping that drink might loosen his tongue. She even adjusted her afternoon strolls to watch the comings and goings at the Decker mansion. What Margaret uncovered confirmed her darkest guesses and even surpassed them. Through careful watching and subtle questioning, she learned that Nathaniel and Rose had been meeting privately for weeks, that their talks went far beyond any suitable business matter, and that both seemed caught in emotions that had nothing to do with family duty. Even more alarming, Margaret began noticing changes in William himself that suggested he might be unwell. At gatherings he looked worn, complained of headaches and stomach pain, and carried himself without the quiet confidence he had once shown in his business affairs. When Margaret mentioned this to her husband, he confirmed that William's work had grown irregular. Nathaniel's been covering for him, Harold Henley reported, after one of his poker nights with the lumber baron. Says the boy's been working too hard and needs rest before the wedding. But the mill supervisors tell another story. They say William can hardly finish a full day without lying down. Margaret's instincts, sharpened through years of uncovering other people's secrets, told her that William's failing health was somehow tied to his father's improper closeness with his son's fiancée. She couldn't yet prove any deliberate harm, but she could feel the presence of hidden truths that were eating away at the normal balance of the Decker household. Her chance for action came on October 17th, just 3 days before the planned wedding ceremony. October 17th, 1888, broke grey and cold with the kind of steady drizzle that turned Fort Smith's dirt roads into streams of mud and kept most decent citizens inside with their fires burning. It was the kind of weather that encouraged private confessions and gave cover to activities that might look suspicious in clear daylight. William had been set to travel to Little Rock that morning to complete arrangements with a new timber buyer, but he complained of such painful stomach cramps that he could hardly stand up. Dr. Samuel Hayes, the family doctor, ordered bed rest and a plain diet, suggesting that the tension of the coming marriage might be troubling William's stomach. Young men often had nervous symptoms before their weddings, Dr. Hayes assured Nathaniel when they spoke in the front parlor of the mansion. A few days of quiet would restore him. Nathaniel accepted this diagnosis with what looked like real concern for his son. But Rose noticed something in his expression that the doctor missed completely. A brief flash of satisfaction, as though William's sickness might not be unwelcome at all. With William stuck in bed, and the Little Rock business deal needing attention right away, Nathaniel declared that he would handle the timber talks himself. The trip might take 2 days, maybe 3 if the buyers proved stubborn, which meant he would miss the final wedding preparations. Perhaps Rose should travel with me, Nathaniel suggested with a tone of casual ease. She's shown such interest in our business, and these meetings could teach her about contracts and prices. Dr. Hayes nodded in approval. A fine idea. Miss Sullivan's presence would soften what could otherwise be harsh business conversations. Rose agreed to the trip with an eagerness that should have stirred suspicion, but everyone read it as loyalty to the family business. In truth, she knew exactly what the proposal meant, a chance to spend real time with Nathaniel, away from the watchful eyes of Fort Smith society. But Margaret Henley, looking from her window as the Decker carriage rolled toward the station, understood at once what she was seeing. A father and his son's fiancée leaving town together, unchaperoned, just days before a wedding already whispered about in connection with improper behavior. Margaret acted quickly. She sent her most trusted servant to the telegraph office with urgent notes to 3 of her strongest contacts in Little Rock, society women whose networks of gossip were as sharp as her own, and who could be trusted to watch closely and report anything strange involving visiting timber dealers and their female companions. More importantly, Margaret made up her mind to pay a visit to poor William Decker. Carrying a basket of herbs and wearing her most sympathetic expression, she arrived at the Decker home within hours of Nathaniel and Rose's departure. William, glad for distraction from his discomfort, welcomed her visit with pitiful eagerness. He looked dreadful, pale, thin, trembling under the heavy blankets. His eyes, normally gentle and bright, now seemed dull and unfocused. "You poor boy," Margaret said, softly, settling by his bed with the practiced calm of a woman skilled in drawing out information from the weak. "Degead. Hayes says it's only nerves, but you look truly sick. Have you been eating properly?" William admitted his appetite had been poor for weeks. Food tasted odd. Even favorite dishes made him queasy. He thought it must be wedding nerves and pressure from new duties. But Margaret's trained eye saw something darker. She remembered similar signs in the winter of 1885, when old Samuel Reeves had wasted away from what was thought to be fever, but which Margaret's sharp suspicion had rightly guessed was arsenic slipped into his meals by a younger wife. The slow loss of weight, the unending stomach pains, the shaky hands, the dulled reactions, all pointed to poison, not simple worry. "Tell me about your meals," Margaret urged gently. "Are you eating the same food as your father and Miss Sullivan?" William thought slowly, his mind heavy and sluggish. "Well, father often eats at the hotel during business. And Rose, she's been dining out with clients quite a lot, learning about business matters." You see, Margaret saw very clearly. If her fears were right, Nathaniel and Rose were making sure William ate the poisoned meals while they stayed safe. It was perfectly timed. A slow poisoning that would finish him off right before or right after the wedding, leaving a grieving father to console his son's sorrowful fiancée. "Who gives you your food, dear?" Margaret asked. "Mrs. Patterson, our cook, usually. Though father sometimes brings me special tonics from Dr. Hayes for my digestion. And Rose has been so kind. She often brings tea or broth when I feel bad." A chill went through Margaret that had nothing to do with the wet October air. Here was proof of opportunity and method, given with the innocent trust of a victim who never guessed that those he loved most were slowly destroying him. But Margaret was far too clever to reveal her suspicions at once. Instead, she spent the rest of the visit asking about the household routine, the timing of William's symptoms, and the details of his connection with his father and Rose. What she learned confirmed her darkest thoughts. His sickness had begun after Rose's arrival. It grew worse as Nathaniel and Rose spent more time together. Most damning, William's condition always seemed a little better when Nathaniel was away on business, only to sink again as soon as he returned. By the time Margaret left the Decker house, she held enough evidence to ruin 3 lives with one conversation. But she knew that claims of poisoning needed more than suspicion, especially when they touched Fort Smith's richest man and his son's Irish bride-to-be. Meanwhile, in Little Rock, Nathaniel and Rose were finding that being away from Fort Smith only made their feelings stronger. The train ride gave them hours of private talk. The hotel left them free from strict watchfulness, and the business meetings showed how well they worked together, far better than social talk alone could. "We make a good team," Nathaniel remarked as they went over contract terms in his hotel room after a day of deals. "You understand the numbers better than William ever has." Rose, warmed by wine and by the thrilling sense of being valued for her mind, rather than only her future as wife and mother, spoke more freely than she had ever dared. "William doesn't really want to understand. He does what's required, but he has no passion for it. He'd rather read poems than build a company." "And you, what would you rather do?" Rose held his gaze. Knowing her answer would decide if they continued their act or faced the truth of what had been building between them for weeks. "I'd rather build an empire," she whispered. Nathaniel's reply came not in words, but in actions that tied them together in both desire and conspiracy. When he kissed her, Rose felt all the barriers of duty and restraint crumble. When she kissed him back, they both knew they had crossed a line from which there was no return. What followed was a night of closeness that showed the real strength of their hidden bond. But it was also a night of plotting, of whispered talks about futures that could only be reached through the quiet removal of troublesome obstacles. "William's sickness is not getting better," Nathaniel said, as they lay side by side in the dim hours before morning. "Dr. Hayes worries it might be something more serious than plain nervous exhaustion." Rose instantly understood what he was hinting at. "How serious?" she asked. "Possibly deadly, if it keeps advancing." They spoke in veiled words and subtle hints, never stating the plan openly, but both were fully aware of what they meant. William's passing would clear their path completely, releasing Rose from a marriage she did not want, while giving Nathaniel the woman he longed for, and a believable reason for their quick union afterward. "These things happen," Rose whispered. "Young men with fragile health sometimes die from sicknesses that stronger men survive." "Exactly." And a grieving father might naturally turn to his son's sorrowful fiancée, offering comfort and protection. But their careful designs faced an unlooked-for problem when they arrived back at Fort Smith the next evening. Margaret Henley was waiting at the train station, her timing far from accidental. "Mr. Decker," she called as they stepped down from the Little Rock train, "I hope your work went well. Poor William has been rather uneasy about your absence." Margaret's voice was perfectly proper, but her eyes gave away a sharper meaning that told both Nathaniel and Rose their secret was no longer fully safe. Here was a woman who suspected too much, who had been watching quietly, drawing her own conclusions that could easily become dangerous. "Mrs. Henley," Nathaniel answered with careful politeness, "how kind of you to ask about our journey. I trust William's health has not worsened while we were gone." "Quite the opposite," Margaret replied. "He looked far better this afternoon, almost as if a change in routine had done him good." The message was plain. Margaret had not only noticed William's illness, but also its strange link with his father's presence. She was warning them that she understood, and that she would be paying close attention to whatever came next. As they rode back through the dark streets of Fort Smith, Rose and Nathaniel both realized their time was running out. Margaret's suspicions meant that any further decline in William's health would be studied with unwanted care. They had to act swiftly, firmly, and in a way that would turn suspicion away rather than draw it closer. The answer, when it came to them, was simple in design yet cold in its cruelty. On the morning of October 19th, 1888, the air was sharp with autumn chill, fitting for what would turn into the last hunt of William Decker's life. Nathaniel told the household at breakfast that he had arranged a farewell hunting trip for his son and a few trusted companions. A kind of bachelor outing to honor William's final day before marriage. William, who had seemed healthier since Nathaniel's return from Little Rock, welcomed the idea with true excitement. He had always enjoyed hunting, despite his gentle personality, and the thought of being outdoors with friends appealed far more than the large bachelor dinner his father had first suggested. "Wonderful plan," William said, his face brighter than it had been in weeks. "Some fresh air and exercise will do me good before tomorrow's ceremony." Rose made sure to show mild disappointment at being left out of the men's gathering, but deep inside, she knew this hunt was the final step in all the plans she and Nathaniel had whispered. They had already gone over the broad outlines in Little Rock, but now she watched Nathaniel set every detail into motion with a cold skill that impressed and frightened her at the same time. The group would consist of 6 men: William, Nathaniel, Harold Henley, Thomas Brennan from the hotel, Dr. Samuel Hayes, and James Crawford, the mill's chief overseer. Every one of them was an experienced hunter, well acquainted with the wooded ridges east of Fort Smith, and all held positions of such respect that their word about an accident in the field would never be doubted. But Rose noticed things the others never thought twice about. Nathaniel picked the hunting grounds himself, a lonely stretch of forest where fallen logs and thick brush made walking hard and sightlines short. He chose particular rifles, saying that certain ones were better suited for deer in close cover. He even proposed the hunting formation, placing himself and William in positions that created chances for what he softly called unfortunate mistakes. "Will you be fine alone for the day?" William asked Rose before leaving. "I hate to leave the day before our wedding." Rose assured him she would keep busy, perhaps visiting other ladies to finish small wedding tasks. What she kept to herself was that she had already arranged to spend the afternoon with Margaret Henley, not out of desire for her company, but because she knew the importance of proving her presence far from the place where the accident was meant to unfold. The hunters set off at first light, rifles and supplies, loaded onto a wagon that carried them deep into the wooded hill where Nathaniel claimed to have spotted deer sign during his recent travels. The men were in high spirits, teasing William about his nerves and placing playful bets on who would shoot the best buck. Dr. Hayes brought along a fine flask of whiskey to toast any victories, while Harold Henley offered a box of cigars from Cuba to mark the occasion. James Crawford, the most seasoned hunter among them, shared advice about tracking and watching the wind to better their chances. Only Nathaniel stayed serious, quietly studying the land, checking sightlines, and arranging the men in ways that matched his hidden purpose rather than their comfort. The timberland stretched over hundreds of acres of uneven ground covered with oak, hickory, and tall pine. Fallen logs and tangled brush created a setting where hunters could be easily separated, where gunfire echoed strangely, and where a man could lie hurt for hours without being seen. Nathaniel recommended that they spread into a wide line, close enough for glimpses, but free enough for each to follow tracks. Everyone welcomed this as proof of his careful leadership, not realizing it also created many chances for father and son to be alone, moments where one gunshot could be blamed on anyone, and no witnesses would be present to challenge the story. The morning passed with only scattered distant shots, but no real trophies. Around noon, they met again in a clearing near a stream, sharing food and coffee while trading stories of tracks and deer sightings. William seemed completely renewed, his earlier weakness lost in the thrill of the chase. He joked freely about his wedding, accepted teasing about married life with good humor, and looked as relaxed as he had in months. "You look like a new man," Dr. Hayes remarked with approval. "Nothing like a day outside to heal the nerves." Nathaniel agreed with a smile that masked his darker thoughts. William did indeed seem like a new man, which only made what was to come appear even sadder and harsher. After their break, the hunters split up once more, this time moving toward an area Crawford swore held fresh tracks. The ground here was rougher still, with steep slopes and heavy cover that demanded careful steps to avoid a fall or losing one's way.